Hello people and welcome to another theory video. Today we're going to talk about something that is talked about very little in this fandom, and that is of course the promise. No, I'm kidding. But we are going to talk about how it is totally and surely about Jon. Again, I'm kidding. Today we're actually going to talk about something else with the promise, something that I noticed in a reread that is making me not totally buy the promises about Jon thing. And the reason I'm starting to believe this is because in the end of Eddard's chapters, the last one, he thinks about how he failed. He thinks about all his failures and broken promises. But here's the thing. The only people who Eddard has failed are Robert and Daenerys. If the promise is about keeping Jon safe, then Eddard has succeeded. If the promise is about turning Jon away from his Targaryen nature, Ned has succeeded. So there is no reason for him to believe that he has failed, and if he ever thought that he was failing, he shouldn't have stayed in King's Landing like he did when he dreamed about the promise. He should have left and went for the Wall, as he was planning to leave anyway. However, he didn't. He thought about the promise, he dreamed about the promise, and he stayed in King's Landing. So you might be asking yourselves, if the promise is about Jon, then who's it about? Well, if you've ever been on my Tumblr or you read any of my Song of Ice and Fire analysis on there, you know that I believe R plus L equals D, B plus A equals J. But I'm not totally sold on the fact that the promise is talking about Daenerys either. If you remember, Eddard thinks he's failed, and the only two people he's failed would be Robert and Daenerys. So if Daenerys is out of this equation, who does that leave left? Well, Robert. Now you might be asking yourselves, Robert? But why? When does it ever talk about the promise being about Robert? Now I understand these questions, and it is very ambiguous. However, the promise never actually is explicitly talked about with Jon around. When he thinks of Jon at any time, the promise is never brought up. However, whenever he thinks about Robert, or Robert is even mentioned, the promise is brought up. Like, in the very first chapter of Eddard, we get the first promise, which is when he's in the crypts with Robert. And then the next time we hear about the promise, it occurs with Robert when they're talking about their past and Jon and bastards. And we don't even get another mention of the promise until Eddard 10 when he dreams of Lyanna and the promise. And then afterwards, he stays in King's Landing, and after the promise, Robert is there once again. It's also worth mentioning that after the dream, he stays in King's Landing. Which, again, as I've said, if he's thinking he's failing the promise, or he's going to fail the promise, he shouldn't be staying at King's Landing, if it's about Jon. And then once again in Eddard 13, he dreams about the crypts and the promises, and then right after Robert is mentioned, Ned is brought to him. And then we get another instance of the promise in the same chapter when Robert makes Ned promise something on his deathbed, which is basically just, serve the boar at my funeral feast, which it doesn't seem that big of a deal. However, he remembers Lyanna's promise right afterwards, which is the promise about Jon again, and it makes it extremely weird because Robert would want to kill Jon if Jon was a Targaryen, and Lyanna would want him to protect Jon. So why would he think of Lyanna's promise if the promise was about protecting Jon from Robert when Robert is making Ned promise something? It doesn't make much sense. Unless the promise is about Robert. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This might dash the idea that the promise is about protecting Jon, but what about the turning away from his nature? Does it take away that? Well, no, not necessarily, but it doesn't mean the promise could have been about turning Robert from his nature. In Eddard 9, we actually learn what Lyanna thinks of Robert, and she says, "Love is sweet, but it cannot change a man's nature." So it's totally possible that the promise was about Lyanna telling Ned to help Robert change his nature. And it's also worth mentioning that Lyanna's death is what brings Ned and Robert back together, and Ned had been fighting the last few battles alone without Robert. So this promise would almost be a way of saying you two need to reconcile. Now, am I saying R plus L doesn't equal J? Well, no, not necessarily. I'm just saying that the promise is probably not about Jon, since he never thinks about Jon and the promise, but whenever the promise is mentioned, so is Robert. The closest we ever get to Eddard thinking of Jon and Lyanna is Eddard 9, but even then we don't even get the promise, and he's even thinking about Rhaegar afterwards. So if R plus L equals J, and the promise is also about Jon, shouldn't he be thinking about the promise as well in that chapter? Now, I also know some people will want to point out that in Ed 2, when he's thinking about the promise, he's also thinking about how he's been living in lies for 14 years. However, yeah, I don't know if this is about Jon either, as in A Dance with Dragons Brand 3, Eddard prays that Catelyn will forgive him, which wouldn't make much sense if Jon is just Rhaegar and Lyanna's son, because he would know that, and the gods would probably know that too. So in conclusion, it seems like the promise may not be about Jon after all, and it also seems to have a tie-in with Robert, as every time the promise is mentioned, Robert is also mentioned, or even there. And even in the last Eddard chapter, he thinks of Robert for 3 pages, and then he thinks about the promise, and he thinks about how he failed it, which makes me believe that the promise is fully and completely about Robert. But who knows, George R. R. Martin could prove me wrong tomorrow. I'll see you guys later.